question going. Hello and welcome everyone. I am JQ Hannah with Food Co-op Initiative, and thank you for joining us for the FCI Live Fall 2022 series. This is our store design versus store design session with 7 roots. This is specifically on a question you guys have asked us again and again. And so we decided to turn to an FCI Live. We're so excited to have dozens of people registered to join us today. And with that, I want you to have time to actually listen to and talk to our experts of the day. So I'm going to turn it over to 7 Roots. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you, JQ. All right, let's see. I think we are going to share screen here. Yes, there we go. Thank you, Joel. All right. So welcome everybody. Hey, thanks for coming. Lots of familiar faces. Good to see you all. So again, store design versus store design. Welcome. We know many of you, but kind of our usual line here. We are 7 Roots, so we're gonna wave at you. Everyone who's 7 Roots. No one who's not 7 Roots, wave. Everyone who's 7 Roots, wave. So we do design and operational support for co-ops and independent grocers. So we're here because we believe in food access and community ownership and cooperation. So we are a proud worker co-op ourselves. So as folks were coming in, JQ had asked to throw your name and your co-op in the or organization in the chat. So please feel free to do that so everyone can kind of say hello. All right. So diving in here. Kevin, you want to take us through outcomes?
Surely. So it's really important when we start to look at these webinars to understand what the outcomes are so that when we finish it, you have a good perspective. And this one's particularly tricky because a lot of the phrases and terms seem similar, but we're here today to understand where the store design fits into store development, to understand the difference between store planning and store design, and understand the difference between preliminary and full store design, and what deliverables to expect and when to expect them, and understand some simple differences between bubble diagrams, schematics, and full fixture plans. And we will leave plenty of time for Q&A at the end of this, but if you do have questions in the immediate moment, feel free to put them in the chat.
Awesome. Thanks. All right, so a little glossary here. So we're gonna get into each of these terms. We're gonna throw around a lot of words, right? And we're gonna get into them in a deeper way as we go through. But just to kind of start us out, we're gonna talk a little bit about what we mean when we're talking about store development, store planning, and store design, right? Because they sound very similar, and we realize that. So store development is sort of the umbrella over it all, right? So planning for and building the physical space that will house your grocery operations. So there's a lot more that goes into store development, right? Because there are other things you got to do, right? You got to have the money to do it. You have to have the operational wherewithal to make it happen. But for the purposes of our conversation today, store development is going to focus on that physical part, and we'll get into that a little further. Store planning and store design, they are a process and 2 processes, right? There's sort of a chicken and egg factor that goes on with store planning and store design, right? So store planning is the first step of store design. It is programming. So we've talked about programming actually in past FCI Live sessions. So if you really want to deep dive on that, go back into that archive and find it. But programming defines what you're going to sell and how you're going to sell it. Meaning, you may say, we're going to sell sandwiches and we're going to sell them wrapped in a grab-and-go cooler, and that's how people will get them. Or you may say, we're going to sell sandwiches and we're going to sell them hot off a panini press, right? So that is programming. That's how that works. So defining those pieces. And then store design is laying out and designing the space based on that planning, right? So planning without design is just like a bucket list of wishes, right? You see these notes down here below. And design without planning is just Tetris, right? It's sort of saying like, oh, this could fit over here and this could fit over there, but it's not necessarily tied to a plan for what the store is actually going to do in that space. Before we go forward, any questions on these terms that we want to kind of get out of the way now? Feel free to throw it in the chat or unmute mute yourselves and quick ask. All right, thank you.
I had to find my unmute button. There we go. So store development. So we're going to circle back and now we're going to dig a little deeper, more than just 1 or 2 lines here. So store development, again, it's the process of planning for building the physical space that's going to house your grocery operations. This is the way that we think of it. And this is a document that we can share with you all offline afterwards, because we're not going to dig into every piece of this. But you can see that there's 3 columns here, and at the top it says financial, site, and community and capacity. So there's really at least three tracks going on when we're doing store development: the financial, the site, community, and capacity. So community and capacity, that's organizational development, building membership, building leadership, your board of directors, that sort of stuff. The financial, that's your pro forma, your capital stack, your capital campaign, market study, all of that stuff. The site, that's what we're going to concentrate on tonight. We'll concentrate on this afternoon, the actual store once you've picked your site. So you see here, we've got site search, design feasibility, and then more stuff happening there. This is where we're going to concentrate on for this session. So let's start at the top here, design feasibility.
All right, so giving you a little bit of a rundown of how design and feasibility interact. So early design work is often an element of site feasibility. The idea here is that work is we're trying to determine how a store can operate within a site. So our approach is to assess the site for challenges and opportunities before we're locking it in, so that then when you go into lease negotiations, you know what you need to succeed. So for example, you need to know, oh, we're going to receive on this side and we might need a variance, or we are going to need a new curb cut, or we need to make sure the landlord's going to provide X, Y, or Z, that kind of a thing. So it naturally includes this early design work because you're sort of testing it and identifying also the rough square footage that you're going to need for each department so that you can meet your sales projections. So feasibility often entails like the first phase, the first 2 phases of design. You basically want to do enough to get the information that you need to move forward to secure your site, but not pay for anything beyond that until you're locked in, because you just don't want to get ahead of yourselves in terms of investment.
I think next slide, right? Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
All right, well, before we get ahead of ourselves, what is store design and why do you need it? So we've gone over that store design is the planning and design of your grocery store. And that's really like where things are actually going to go. You need it because the operations of a grocery store are really more dynamic and involved. And it really involves a lot of different parties, like an architect or a different design team in the city. And this one building needs to do a lot of things. from receiving to the retail sales floor, administrative functions, food prep, trash. There's like a lot going on here. And it's a lot more dynamic than most buildings, like an office space. They only have a few functions, and that's why you need to have like a specialized design team that understands these nuances and can plan for them. Grocery store designers know all of the details and how those things need to interact and how to make them happen efficiently, both in your space usage and your operations.
So when does this actually start to happen? So our typical answer is it depends on the phase. Store design informs decision-making, and can this site and location work to become a successful grocery store? And secondly, financial considerations. You look at the site and say, well, this might cost us, 20% more than this other site. So, one of the phases that we'll need to get into at some point to really drill down and figure it out, we'll need to have a fixture plan to build it. And each department, when we start to do the fixture plan, we break down each department to know exactly what we need in order to merchandise and sell the products that we're gonna, put up for sale to customers.
At this point, you're probably thinking, okay, great. When do I need this? Are we late? Should we have started this already? And it depends on the project. It can never hurt to have conversations early, but it's going to depend. Is this a new build, from the ground up, or are you going to own it? Are you going to lease it? All those sorts of things are factors. Once you identify possible sites, you can determine design and site feasibility through the initial stages of store design, like we talked about earlier, where you get those bubble diagrams, you start doing the site planning. And again, the site planning, the programming, it's a combination of your wish list and what we call the numbers.
Yeah, so the numbers, that's a whole thing, right? So we call numbers-based design is what we call our approach to store design. And basically, all it really means is that we're designing your store to meet your sales projections. So going back to programming, which again, reminder, programming is what you sell and how you sell it. Those decisions are based on your market study and pro forma. So, when you're thinking about how many square feet does each department need, and, how does labor factor in, and what sort of systems we need, like those factors go in when those programming decisions are made, right? And that's to say, no Tetris, right? We're making informed choices here about why things go where they go, what's going where, to make sure that it's going to work well for customers, work well for staff, and get the co-op what it needs to achieve financially.
Okay, so what does this look like? So the design piece is broken down to several phases, which are all represented as deliverables. So today we're going to focus on a few, but generally these are those design deliverables. So the first one is a bubble diagram. This really is just an initial phase. This is not a drawing that you can give to an architect or something like that. It's just a concept. And then we move into schematics, and then preliminary plans, and then the final fixture plan. And the final is the final. And we'll get into that a little bit later.
Great. So the bubble diagram. So as it says here, this is when we're in exploration and feasibility. The main purpose is to illustrate the store programming, itemize the departments that must be in the layout. It's pre-design, it's conceptual. We look at overall space allocation. As you can tell by looking at this, it's not highly refined. It's not, we're not drilling down to the exact details. We're getting a good 10,000 foot view, figuring out the pieces. It will inform the schematic design. So what's most useful in feasibility is where you really want to use this bubble diagram, because you don't want to invest in a schematic design and be trying a bunch of different things. This is the place to try variations, to try a right-handed store or left-handed. How does that affect things? Moving departments around, you can do it much more quickly and easily in a bubble diagram. You get a sense of what will or won't work in the space.
And next up, we have schematic design, which is still, for all intensive purposes, conceptual, right? But because we've moved into this phase, it is now to scale. And you can see that there are a lot of different colors, and you can kind of move through the store easier because you've already decided all of these adjacencies. So the square footage of the department is laid out and based off the market study, the pro forma, and any other data and info that you've given to your store designer. And that can be member owner surveys. That could be like if you have a receipt program, or any of the stuff that you've been gathering before your design team comes on is put into this schematic plan. A little bit on the color blocks. Why do we use them? Because this one is going to change. The schematic plan, you might have 2 versions, you might have 10 versions. This is the time where you know the size of the departments, you know what your programming is going to be roughly, and so you're able to move things around and say, like, your wellness is going to be in the same spot now as your grocery, so you have to move it around. At least you know the size and what you're working with. An architect is not necessarily involved yet. So the walls are conceptual, and while everything is to scale and like major codes are followed, an architect still needs to come in and look at some of those local codes, so that way you can move on to the next phase of design.
Oop, I'm talking without my mute button undone. Sorry about that. So schematic, let's see. It's a pretty popular phase, right? So this is often where we might go for feasibility to start to look at things, and often schematic is what we have for a while, right? Because this is usually pre-official design. So looking at, what can we do with schematic and what can't we do with schematic? So again, it's a concept, it's not a fixture plan. Other disciplines, meaning architects, engineers, contractors, those folks can't really work with a schematic plan because it's only a concept, right? They're just ideas. We've got blocks of color. So what we can do is begin some really basic cost estimations of construction and equipment. You can show your member owners, so get them excited. Have an architect take a look so that they can sort of give feedback, or to give them a sense of what they might be in for if you hire them. And then also you can use a concept like this to start to hire the rest of the team, right? Those other folks who are going to need to come on board. So you can show them, hey, this is what this is looking like now. What can't you do with a schematic design? Anything with details, right? So we don't have the ability here to fully specify equipment, get really detailed with our architectural plans, or, again, Nicole said, this isn't fully up to code, detailed programming, labor, and most importantly, we can't get building permits, right? So you got to go a lot further with a lot more detail before anyone's going to say, yeah, sure, go ahead and build this.
All right, we have a question in the chat. Nicole said we could have as many as 10 different schematic designs. Does that include basic options or approaches such as diagonal aisles versus parallel aisles?
Great question. The reason oftentimes that we can have so many is because there are just little tweaks, right? And as you can imagine, when you go through a plan, if you make one change, it affects the entire fixture plan. So if you're like, I'm going to add 4 more feet of, refrigerated produce case, then you have to adjust the rest of the fixture plan. So it looks like a small, or rest of the schematic plan, sorry. It looks like a small change, but it's going to be affecting everything. So that would be one iteration. Oftentimes you do want to try something fun, like, hey, let's move the seating to, the end of the registers versus, by the deli or whatever it is. It's figuring out what those adjacencies are and doing multiple iterations of them. So that way you have that information. Oftentimes, though, there are buildings that have these restrictions, like you can only have your entrance in one spot, or you can only have your receiving in one spot. So those you're a little bit more limited in what you can and can't do. And so oftentimes we will have a few less iterations because we don't have as many choices.
All right, excellent. Thank you, Barbara at Wasatch. All right, so decision time. Dun, dun, dun. Up until now, we've been in concept mode. We've been playing around with different scenarios. We've been kicking the tires. Now we're going to make a commitment as we move into preliminary design.
This is my favorite stage. It's also the longest phase because you have all of these other disciplines that are coming in and making comments and changes, and you have all of these documents that are working together. So this is when you take that schematic conceptual layout and build in the details. Programming becomes more detailed as we start to place equipment. Not just the color blocks are like, yeah, it's kind of the right size, but we're choosing manufacturers and we're figuring out how many shelves per 4-foot section do you need based off your merchandising plan. All of those things go into it, and it informs the rest of the equipment needs. And sometimes there's back and forth between the two. For example, like if you have a bulk department and we really have a limited amount of space, you can either do nut butters and have grinders, or you can do bulk spices. We have to decide which you want to include, and that has to be based off of those numbers and the financial details, especially when you're talking about labor. If you have a nut butter grinder, you're going to have a higher labor cost than you are if you just have bulk spices. So we have to make sure that your entire labor budget can accommodate for that. We want to make sure that you have your support staff. That way you can maintain all the functions of the department and that you're able to put in the systems to support that. And this is really where other disciplines can start doing their work, because you have all of those equipment specifications done. You can lay out your drain locations. You can figure out what your electrical load is and all of those things. And then we all work together to inform the final design phase, which is when everything is set in stone and you're not making any changes.
All right.
So
before we move
Go
on
ahead,
to
Joe.
that, though, we do have a question in the chat that I think is good to talk about while we're in this schematic preliminary phase. Free Range wants to know, do you need a site selected before you get started on schematic design? Or if you know you're building new on any potential site, should you be starting earlier so you can prep capital campaign? Great question. Who wants it? Heather?
Ooh. This is a tough one. I think
I have a thought. My
I
thought is
Nicole. I want Nicole.
all right, go Nicole.
All right, so
I'll sidekick.
when you're looking for a site, it's a really good idea to have some specifications that meet your needs. So what kind of site you're looking for? Is it the right location? What's the synergy between all the businesses around? And then you can start looking for some of those potential sites, whether it's just a empty lot or it's an existing building. There's a lot of different variations. You really can't start any of the design phase until you have an idea of what you need. So you have your market study that tells you approximately 4,000 square foot retail, right? And then you have to go in and find all those details and then start working on a site plan if it's a new build, or more detailed construction specifications if it's an existing building or maybe something historical. Let's see.
Yeah, and the more I'm looking at this and thinking about it, you really do want to have your site selected, because even things about where are you orienting things? Oh, how's traffic coming in off the street? Where are the trucks going to be able to pull in? Those all factor in. And so in theory, could, we sort of guess about a lot of things and try to make something? Yes, but it would be somewhat of a work of fiction that you would then have to pay to redo once you have the details. So, yeah, I think
You
in
can-
that
you can
way,
compare
that's kinda
multiple
tough.
sites, right? So if you have a big chunk, we often will work with clients and we'll try to narrow it down to like the top 3 or the top 5 or whatever. And then you can start doing some of that bubble diagram work
Right.
based off of those choices. And that kind of helps you move along and be like, yeah, these are the 2 that we really want to pursue, and start talking with a developer, like a realtor.
Mhm. Ooh, we got lots of questions coming in. All right. We've got how long?
Let's grab Don's first.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Since we're talking about the pre-site stuff.
Yeah.
John's question is, how about the program? Can you start on that before you have a site?
A little bit, right? Like
Yes.
you can have a good idea of what your community wants, what your members, owners want. You can do surveys. There's a lot of information that you can gather before you have a site. The actual programming piece, though, you need to have that physical space so that you know where it's going to go and what systems need to be in place in order to make that design happen. But it's a really long, awesome process that has a lot of information and data that gets built into this plan. So there's a lot that you can have up front. There's a lot that you're going to get in the middle of these design phases. And then that's going to carry through until your opening.
Great. Excellent. Good question. Thanks, Don. All right. So we're going to jump back in here. We've been moving through the deliverables and the phases from bubble to schematic to preliminary. And now we're moving on to final fixture plan.
And, you know, the thing about this is that it's hard to note the difference. It looks a lot like the preliminary plan. It's similar in level of detail, but once we get to the final fixture plan, we're final. And the fixture plan will include all the details for all the other disciplines and trades associated with the design and the building process. It locks in the exact locations of electrical and plumbing components like floor drains and all the stuff that is really, really, really super expensive to move once you start doing this. In other words, these are the, we all look at it, these are the blueprints that we're going to use to build the store now. And so once we get here, this is where we're going. And this is what your store is going to look like now.
So some of you might be thinking, all right, if we need that final fixture plan, well, should we just skip schematic? It looks pretty much the same. Why don't we skip that step and go right to the preliminary design and into the final fixture plan? And we alluded to it earlier. We've been kind of dropping hints along the way here. Again, when we're in that bubble phase, when we're in the schematic phase, we're incorporating those various wish lists and the store planning and programming, but it's only at a high level. But it's the time to play with all these multiple scenarios. Do we want a big deli versus small grab and go, like Heather was talking about? Oh, are we going to have beer and wine or no? Or what's that going to look like? More bulk, less bulk? Are we going to carry all the cheese? We're going to try out these different scenarios, see how they fit with our pro forma and our market study, see what the numbers look like. We're going to kick the tires on the pros and cons, find the win-win solutions, prioritize you and your community's wants and needs. So you end up doing those multiple versions and iterations early on. And then as things get closer and closer, we think, all right, now we're getting close here. Now is when we add in all that detail. But if we had that detail earlier, and if we tried skipping schematic, then we'd be reworking things with all that extra detail. And that would take too much time and cost you too much money to do iterations in that mode.
All right, so another one. When does an architect come in? So it depends on the situation, right? So like all of all of this, right? It's all kind of going to be custom to your space and what you're up against and what's the situation. But typically, sometime during schematic is a good time to involve an architect, right? Sometimes they'll just happen to be involved already, great, right? But sometimes it's that, you know, we get to the end of schematic and we're ready to go out and you can hire an architect, right? And then other times you might want them, you know, prior to that, sooner. And that again is sort of dependent on what kind of a building we're looking at. What are the big questions we're facing? You know, is it that we need an architect to help answer some of those questions so that you can move forward with lease negotiations? But typically that's where we want them. And definitely once we're headed into preliminary design, we want to have an architect on board so that they're there to, like we said, kind of put those hard parameters around so that we can all kind of work within the full confines of local code and all that. So we're being efficient from this point forward.
Great.
So just to reiterate what we started out as with our outcomes, you know, where does store design fit into store development? What's the difference between store planning and store design? The difference between preliminary and full store design, the deliverables to expect and when to expect them, and then the difference between all the different phases: bubble, diagram, schematic, and fixture plan. And I know there's going to be a lot of questions, so we're going to leave a lot of room for that. And, you know, we're going to turn it over to Joel here. He can be the facilitator for that.
All right. We're into the Q&A. We've got lots of great questions here in the chat. I'm trying to organize them right now. Let's see, which one do we want to tackle first here? Why don't we just take them in order? I was trying to make them like make thematic sense, but why don't we just go in order here? Free Range asked, what's the time frame look like? How long do these design phases take after you have a site?
All right, so let's see. Nicole, let's tag team this one. So when you say after site, I'm going to just say starting with feasibility, that can take, you know, 6 weeks. It can take 6 months, right? You know, to do the actual work of determining some of the factors and sort of knowing what you're up against, that can happen in a matter of a couple months. But then when you factor in, oh, we got to negotiate the lease and have a bunch of back and forth and all of those details, sometimes we've seen it really stretch on for folks. And getting that detail right is critically important, right? So what you don't want to do is be in an agreement that doesn't ultimately support the financial well-being in particular of the co-op. So that's what you're sort of looking at for feasibility. And depending on what all you're including in that, you know, it can happen quickly or it could take a bit longer. So
yeah, like any phase with a co-op, our business model is so different from other corporations. We have like capital campaigns and we don't have all the money up front when we decide we're going to open a grocery store. So we have to be able to work with the design team and, you know, inform them that like, hey, we might have an extra 6 months here because we need to raise this money now that we know how much it's going to cost. And so like while those phases could be shorter and probably are for like insert your local grocery store name here, it is really the capital piece that's going to push our timelines a little bit back. And that's another reason to have an experienced design team so that they are aware of those different milestones that you have to hit before you can continue on to the next phase.
So then when you look at, and we actually have something with this as well that we can, so some of you were asking about the roadmap and if we could send that. We do also have a document that sort of lays out some of the phases and like typical timing. So we've got 8 to 12 weeks for schematic planning, if you're just kind of diving in, right? Project development, which is that, preliminary design, is typically 6 to 8 months. Again, that typically incorporates some time where you're raising capital and making sure this thing is a go and working through your contingency. And then another few months is kind of finalizing that final fixture plan. We're using big ranges here and sort of squishy language, but it's in part because the actual work of the design usually does not dictate the timeline. So that's really the thing. The timeline is run by developers, is run by, folks who are approving your permits and, a lot of inside organizational timing factors are usually what's driving the timeline, more so than your fixture plan design. Is that helpful? Are there any follow-up questions on that in particular? All right.
Well, I actually kind of have a follow-up question. So I was kind of curious as to what your workload is right now and how much new work you can take on.
Well,
We're almost always.
We're not turning anyone away.
yeah.
Um,
The door isn't closed, sure.
The projects
So.
that you're working on take over a year, right? And there are going to be points where we would be really involved, and there are going to be points where we're less involved and more like an informative, like right-hand person to your design team. By the time you have construction starting, you're going to have your store planning done, you're going to have your equipment ordered, you're going to have your interior design done, but it really does take, a year or more to do all of that. So bringing on clients at different points is kind of how we've been able to manage a lot more workload than, we thought.
All right, what's up next, Joel?
What I'm seeing is, what are the optimal points where owners should be engaged in the process, and what are best practices for helping architects, etc., understand that this is part of the co-op process? That's a good one. That's Amanda with Louisville.
That is a really good one. Ooh, so let's see. I mean, the beginning is a great time to have owners engaged, right? The kind of building the dream of it all and creating that vision. And that's really where we start, so if we teamed up with you tomorrow and we said, okay, let's build this thing, our first step would be, all right, let's create the vision. Let's all get together and talk about what you want to see, right? And you build the big vision, and then you kind of go back to the numbers like we talked about and say, all right, now what's really possible, or what are ways that we can take those sort of hopes and dreams and capture as many parts of them as possible and see those, kind of in the physical space and what's doable. But that is typically a fun place to sort of do some engagement and get folks in on building that vision out. And also can be down the line. Nicole, I know you probably want to speak to this a little bit too, because you've done a lot of this.
Well, I was going to speak more to helping the architect understand.
Right. I was thinking about that too. All right. So down the line, you might want to, sometimes when you get further and you're looking at sort of, fixtures or little colors, or, if you're looking to engage with people, right, there are opportunities. Once things get visual, it's fun for owners and community members to grab on that way, right? So there are a few different points, sometimes when you're just like moving coolers around, it's not a great time to have them engaged. So, early on, And it's not necessarily going to be something that we'll say, oh, look, you know, here's the results, here's your schematic, right? But to kind of get them going. And then when interior design choices are being made and things like that, that's another time to kind of bring in folks in on that process with the visuals. So yeah, second question up is awesome.
Well, and I'll say one of the tactics that you could use is to present a plan and say, here's what your board has been working on, and this is the result, rather than asking for input on where they think the shelving should go or what cereal they want on the shelf. Because you really want valuable engagement, and you want to be able to use all of the opinions that your community is giving you, and still being able to give them a product that they can feel proud of, right? They're not going to move around the coolers. That is an informed decision that you've already made, and yet you want them to be engaged. So there's like a little bit of back and forth with that, and more strategy than you would think would be involved. Let's see, helping architects. Well, this is fun. This is why you have a qualified, experienced co-op team. Because we do have such a different business model, architects are not going to be used to waiting. They're not going to be used to 6-week-long capital campaigns where their project is on hold. And so much like other projects, or, you know, I'm sure all of you have had experience where a lot of the work that you do relies on your, you know, work path. Right. So if we're going to hold them up for 6 weeks from all of the other projects that they have, we need to let them know ahead of time so that they can adjust their timeline and all of their project timelines to meet ours. And it can be frustrating for a lot of design professionals if they don't know that up front. And so we talk with them at the very beginning of that process and be like, hey, at this point, you're probably going to see this little bit of a delay. At this point, we're going to see a little bit more. It doesn't mean that the work and the project has to stall, because oftentimes we're working with them on utilities or equipment, and we're doing, you know, other things that might not be moving forward in the way that, you know, other people would see outside of the organization. But it's just a lot slower at certain points. And so we just need to be really honest and have that upfront information for them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that, you know, to piggyback on what Nicole is saying, you know, when we say our process, you know, it's speaking to the process of developing a co-op versus developing other types of businesses. So it's not necessarily the store design process per se. It's again, that capitalization piece, that readiness piece, all of those things. They look different. You know, if Target wants to open a store and they want to hire your architect to help, they probably won't. They usually have their own, you know, but it's going to look a lot different because Target already knows everything that they need to do, and they can kind of like plunk, it just kind of goes in. So yeah, starting out, you know, at the beginning, doing the roles and responsibilities, making it clear to folks what it's going to look like is, you know, good communication, just kind of that normal stuff that makes everything better.
All righty. Do we need an architect if you provide the final fixture plan? It says final schematic design, but I think you meant final fixture plan there. We already talked about how long do the processes take. Yeah, so do we need an architect?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Typically your architect is going to be the one that provides the shell drawing. So like the outside piece, they're going to work with your city planners, your civil engineers, mechanical, electrical, plumbing. They're going to be able to give your store planner that drawing, and it's going to be accurate and it's going to be to code. You need to have that before you can get anywhere near a preliminary or a final plan, because we could do some of that work based off of experience, but then we're going to hand it to an architect and they're going to be like, oh, no, you need columns every 20 feet. And we didn't accommodate for columns. So all of your fixtures then need to move to accommodate these changes. And that will continue to happen. And so if we provided a plan to an architect, they're going to charge you a heck of a lot more money, because we're going to have to go back to that drawing board at least a little bit to make those accommodations.
What about working with the landlord's architect?
That is tricky because then that architect works for your landlord, not for you. So they're going to put the landlord's needs ahead of yours. We have seen successful projects, but it's not something that I would say is, if you have other options and you're able to bid out that project, I would highly recommend doing that rather than just accepting it. Even if it's like less expensive or it seems easier or your landlord really wants you to do that, just shop around a little bit. Yep, conflict of interest. I see that. Absolutely.
Yeah. The
Yeah, if
same
I can
thing
just
like
throw
when
in,
you're,
I've seen
yeah.
that play out, and Nicole, I'm sure you've seen the same, is, there's a point at which your architect actually is, especially with a landlord, or especially if it's a new build, is kind of negotiating on your behalf for things that you need. And that architect is not negotiating on your behalf. So you are at a disadvantage. And I've seen that play out in ways in projects where people are like, oh, no big deal. They need this. They need this. And it's all about what the landlord needs. And that has played out pretty darn poorly once the store is built. I'm sure Nicole will tell a lot of stories, but I just want to say, like, they are not negotiating on your behalf, and they should be part of your negotiation team to get what you need in a way that also meets your landlord's needs.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. That's a great way of putting it. And I mean, if you think about architecture, it's so highly specialized and specific. I mean, they're advocating for you in ways that you don't even understand. Sometimes that we don't even understand, right? So it really is one of those things where it pays to have someone on your team who really knows it.
Yeah, I can give like a short example. Had a project once where it was a new build and it was going to be a multi-use building. So they had the co-op on the bottom level and there were 3 floors of apartments above. Typically, we want to have like our refrigeration system on the roof because it's a gravity fed system. So you want all your pipes to flow down. Well, the landlord's architect, who was also the co-op's architect, was instructed by the landlord to put it out back because they didn't want to have to figure out how to put all those piping pieces and chases through the tenant space, right? So that caused a lot of friction with the refrigeration installer, with the co-op. It took up a lot of space that they needed for parking. So they lost like 4 parking spots. And really, if you had an architect on your team that was able to go in and be like, no, we have to have this if you want this co-op here, and really like be an advocate, it would have been a lot better situation. But this architect worked for the landlord. So they were going to be working with what the landlord needed first.
There you go. I see we've got one more question queued up here. I did get a private message offline from someone who was on the call and then had to jump off, but they said, regarding timelines, they just kind of laughed because right now they've been sitting and waiting for the landlord to get the permits, and they've just been stuck for several months. They've been ready to go. We're ready to go. So he was just saying, there's things we don't control when we look at the timelines. So, and that was one of them. So our last question, at least so far, at what point in this process do you bring on the GM?
Should you or do you, or two different?
Do you? At what point in this process? So
I would say typically about a year out, that would make it pretty easy for your GM to have like their mark on the fixture plan. I see startups, and Jake, you probably see a lot more than we do, but about like 6 months out. And by then there's no changes. So your GM is going to come in and it might not feel like their store, right? Because they didn't do a lot of the work that has been done before they got there. So a year is really best. And we see a lot of different things based off of finances and finding a qualified person.
Yeah, I will add real quick that you do need, people are doing that 6-month thing, and for multiple reasons, that it really doesn't work. And sometimes the project stops because the GM feels so strongly the store gets partially redesigned. And some boards have actually even approved that, and it's pushed the project way out. But if you don't have a GM, if you're going to make that 12-month mark because you just can't find talent, it's literally time to also start investigating the IGM, the temporary general manager for opening stores as a possibility as well. What we don't want is you're down to like, well, we'll get someone at 6 months, and because you can't find talent, we're at 4 months. But in the design process, it's absolutely about they need to be part of the schematic design if at all possible.
Yeah, there you go. Thanks, JQ. I was just gonna flip that around. We were talking about, oh, how far up from opening, but everything we've been talking about today has been starting from the beginning and going forward. And so, yeah, in that schematic, a preliminary area, it's tough to tell. Is that going to be 12 months? Like we were just talking about, there's things that are out of our control within that 12-month period, but that's probably where you want to be bringing someone on.
And I would also add, from a programming standpoint, I mean, we can design all the programming if you want, but that's not really what you're looking for. You want a person who's going to be there, and you're going to hire some professional expertise to program what the store is going to need, and we'll assist them with that. But you want the GM with their hands in the programming.
Yep. All right. I think we handled all the questions in chat.
Keep them coming though. Who's got more?
We've got about 3 more minutes here. So if anyone has more questions, okay. Not a question, but thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
Maybe some herbal tea,
Meditation.
or a massage. We were just talking about the benefits of massage earlier.
Ooh, a ballpark budget for services. It depends. I'm just gonna cruise right into that one. It kind of depends what's included, and it depends on the size of your store as well, right? Who's on your team. So that's a tough one to answer, right? So 4,000 retail.
Well, and there's also multiple
services,
right? Like
but yeah,
store planning and design.
Full package, 4,000 retail. We would have to kind of look at some things. Yeah, wow. Yeah. Let's see, honestly, yeah, without being coy here, we just don't want to say things that aren't accurate. So I would say, for any of you, if you're looking for that, we can provide sort of some ballpark numbers if we have like a list of assumptions. So please feel free to reach out. Yeah, we're not looking to sidestep the question, but we just don't want to say something we can't stand behind.
And what we like to do is we like to meet with you, talk about the project, get a sense of the complexity, and agree on a scope, because there's a bunch of stuff that we do, and it's stuff that you may or may not need. So before we start, putting price tags on everything, let's figure out what it seems like you're really going to need. So, would it include a site visit? We love to go on site, and we do feel that whenever possible, especially over the last few years, it didn't happen as often, but it's great to go and really get boots on the ground, and get a sense of the community, meet folks face to face. We think there's a lot of value in that, so we always try to work in at least one site visit, usually 2, into our projects.
And we try to get as many of us there as possible. That way there's the whole team that can answer questions and kind of go through things, since we all do different disciplines that go together. It's just nice to have us all on site. Oh, yep, Don. Yes.
So thank you, Don. Yes, we do early feasibility work. We've been doing that with a number of folks. And like one of our most grateful clients for feasibility work was when we told them, do not pursue this site. And we were so worried about that, and they were very grateful that we assessed the site and we just said, look, these are all the challenges we see. On the whole, we don't think it's worth it. And they were like, thank you so much. And they're regrouping.
Really?
So
It stinks when it happens, but yeah, I don't know.
But it actually saves the future of your co-op.
Yeah.
JQ did put a note into chat as well. Yeah, if your GM doesn't really have the depth of knowledge to do all that departmental planning and everything. So we really see it as a both and. You want someone there who's going to be invested and is going to be there day to day, and folks like us, we think, can bring that bigger expertise when it's needed. So
I will mention that the trend that's developing, so this is coming from me, we are seeing more and more that possibly why we're setting up some GMs to fail who could otherwise successfully run the store is that they are not project managers. They have not run a store anywhere near your size before, or they've not worked in your community before, and they're from a completely different region and don't understand how people shop in your region. More likely, they have management experience, but they've never actually designed a store. And so we actually are starting to see that as something that some startups are going to have to push in and look at, is that it may, with some candidates, be right for your expert design team and financial team, which that could include Don Moffitt, Seven Roots, to actually get into some pretty graphic detail about what the plan is, and to present that as a done deal with defined spaces for the wiggle room for the incoming GM, depending on their knowledge base. But there are people who can do an excellent job of running a food co-op who cannot programmatically design a food co-op. So it's something to consider, is where will that expertise come from if the right candidate or the best candidate you can find doesn't have it. People always say they can do some things, but do they have experience doing that thing? We all have opinions, but there's a difference between opinion and someone who's done it 40, 50, 100 times.
Yeah, I would say ask them if they know how many cubic feet of refrigeration that they need for their frozen foods to accommodate 4 different SKUs of ice cream, 5 different SKUs of frozen pizzas, and maybe 10 different SKUs of veggies. If they can answer that question, like, that sounds great.
I'm going to go to, I hate to say it, I'm going to go to our closing here. And then, but I almost going to say, if I don't know if they need, the Seven Roots team can stay after we always stop recording on time. And then if people want to stay and talk, please feel free, because I have even more to say to that. I don't know about some of the rest of you geeks. But I want to just thank them so much, Seven Roots, for being here. There will be a follow-up email coming out. It will have their direct email where you can write them and ask them for any of the tools you saw today. It also will have a quick survey. It's 3 questions about how this session went for you today, so we can plan the best FCI lives possible for you. We'd really appreciate that. As well as any information that showed up in the chat. I will pull out the best pieces and put that in an attachment for y'all. We have coming up one more session today to be a white ally on food justice. There was a lot of interest in this topic. We're expecting it to be really lively tonight. And then Joel will be back tomorrow talking to us about a perfect month in the life of your board. How do you plan everything out, schedule everything out so the board works and seemingly seamlessly? Joel's going to be here to talk to you about that. And then Black cooperatives and forward mobility. We're very excited that Kenya Baker from Dayton Unified Power, for the first time, will be here doing a whole session on her own. She's been on some panels, but she's really going to go in depth on how you do the community organizing piece to really move forward your Black cooperative. So we hope some of you will be here for that. We just need to take a minute. This whole session would not be possible, this whole series, without the USDA, National Cooperative Bank, National Cooperative Grocers, and CoBank. Thanks so much to them. And with that, I'm going to stop the recording. Anyone who has time and wants to is welcome to stay and chat.